Nevada? That's impossible. I never authorized that.
Sir, the change was verified using your mother's maiden name. It wasn't an error.
My mother's name? Who would know that?
On the third day of the month, Arthur Pendleton discovered his government had declared him worthless. The Social Security check he was counting on to prove a point to his children, the very foundation of his 30-day experiment in frugality, had simply vanished. How do you fight for a lifeline when the system itself has cut the rope? Her collection of porcelain birds gathered a fine layer of dust on the mantelpiece, a layer Arthur couldn't bring himself to disturb, as if wiping it away would also wipe away some lingering essence of her presence. He lived surrounded by the quiet hum of memory. Since Eleanor's passing 3 years ago from a swift and merciless cancer, the silence in the house had become his constant companion. The world is full of risks, not just from strangers, but sometimes from the people closest to you, those driven by desperation. Checking your bank statements, monitoring your credit, and fiercely guarding your personal information isn't paranoia, it's the necessary stewardship of the life you have built. You must be your own most diligent protector. Second, honest communication is the only true safety net. He had let pride stop him from seeing his children's desperation, and they had let shame stop them from telling him the truth. He learned that asking for help and offering it without judgment are two of the most powerful financial tools a family can possess. A conversation, however difficult, is always cheaper than a crisis. Finally, he learned that the systems we depend on are only as strong as the people who run them and the people who watch over them. The Social Security system was not a magical, infallible source of funds. It was a massive, complex bureaucracy, vulnerable to fraud and error. You have to be your own advocate, to be persistent, and to fight for what is yours, because no one will fight for you as hard as you will. One bright Sunday afternoon in late spring, Arthur was in his backyard tending to Eleanor's rose bushes, the scent of blossoms heavy in the warm air. Mark was there with him, quietly tilling the soil in a new vegetable patch they had decided to plant together. They worked in a comfortable silence for a long time, the only sounds the scrape of the trowel and the chirping of birds in the old oak tree. "The tomatoes are looking good," Mark said, breaking the silence. He straightened up, wiping a smear of dirt from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Your mother always had a knack for tomatoes," Arthur replied, snipping a dead bloom from a rose bush. He looked at his son, his back strong as he worked the earth, and saw not a failure or a success, but simply a man trying his best. The anger and the deep wound of betrayal were still there, a faint scar on his heart that would likely never fully fade, but they were now interwoven with a new, more complicated kind of love. It was a love that had been tested by the worst kind of fire and had, somehow, survived. "You know, Dad," Mark said, leaning on his shovel. He looked at Arthur directly, his gaze steady and clear. "That whole experiment you wanted to do, it was a stupid idea." Arthur stopped his work, and a slow smile spread across his face. The first, genuine, unburdened smile he'd had in a long time. It was the first time they had spoken of it so directly in months. "Yes," Arthur said, his voice full of a wisdom he hadn't possessed a year ago. "Yes, it was. I was trying to teach you a lesson about money, but it turns out I was the one who needed to learn a lesson about value. It wasn't an empty silence. It was filled with the ghosts of conversations, the echo of her laughter in the hallway." He filled it with the familiar rhythms of maintenance and order, polishing the silver, weeding the flower beds, organizing the pantry. It was how he kept the chaos of grief at bay, by imposing order on the small world he could still control. His two children, Sarah and Mark, were the living, breathing extensions of his and Eleanor's love, yet they seemed to operate on a different set of principles altogether. Sarah, a single mother of two working as a paralegal, was perpetually stressed, a coiled spring of anxiety. Her phone calls were a litany of daycare costs, car repairs, and the ever-present threat of an unexpected bill that could capsize her fragile budget. She was a good mother, a hard worker, but she seemed to be constantly treading water in a sea of financial uncertainty. Mark, who sold high-end electronics, lived a life that seemed to Arthur a precarious balancing act of smoke and mirrors. He had a flashy German car with a lease payment that made Arthur's eyes water, a condo with a view of the city skyline, and a wardrobe that cost more than Arthur's mortgage payments used to be. Yet beneath the polished surface, there was always a sense of desperation simmering. An investment that was about to pay off, a big commission that was just around the corner. He was chasing a lifestyle he couldn't quite afford, always one deal away from either salvation or ruin. They were good kids, he knew. They loved him. They called, they visited, they brought the grandchildren who filled the house with a joyous noise that temporarily banished the ghosts. But they didn't understand his world, the world of patient saving and deferred gratification. They saw his comfortable, debt-free life not as the hard-won result of a lifetime of careful choices, but as a resource, a safety net, for them. He was the first national bank of Dad, always open, always solvent. The conversation that sparked his fateful experiment happened on a Sunday afternoon, the air thick with the smell of roast chicken and the unspoken tension of finances. Sarah had come over with her kids, Liam and Chloe, a whirlwind of youthful energy that briefly chased the ghosts from the corners of the house. Mark arrived later, looking tired but dressed impeccably in a crisp shirt that probably cost $200. After dinner, once the grandchildren had been dispatched to the backyard with a new soccer ball, the conversation inevitably turned to money. It always did. "Dad," Sarah began, her voice hesitant. She twisted a paper napkin in her lap, shredding it into a small, damp pile. "Liam needs braces. The orthodontist is talking $5,000. I've run the numbers a dozen times. I don't know how I'm going to swing it." Before Arthur could formulate a response that was both empathetic and instructive, Mark chimed in, leaning forward with an air of conspiratorial excitement. "And I've got this opportunity, Dad. A real estate deal. My buddy's flipping a property in the old mill district. It's a sure thing. I just need to come up with 10 grand for a couple of months to be a minority partner. The return would be huge. It would solve a lot of my cash flow problems." Arthur felt a familiar tightening in his chest. It was a cocktail of love, pity, and a profound, frustrating disappointment. He looked at his children, both in their late 30s, and saw the same panic he'd seen in his own parents' eyes during the lean years of his childhood. But this was different. His parents' struggle was born of scarcity, of a world with fewer opportunities. His children's struggle, he believed, was born of indiscipline. "You two earn good money," he said, his voice calmer than he felt. He carefully placed his fork and knife together on his plate, a gesture of finality. "Combined, you earn far more than your mother and I ever did at your age, even adjusting for inflation." "It's different now, Dad," Mark said, a defensive edge to his voice. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the stack of bills on his kitchen table, because this wasn't just about money. It was about a lesson he meant to teach, now turned into a public humiliation. This was the core fear of every man his age realized, to become a ghost in the machine, your existence reduced to a series of errors on a screen. But the truth was far more sinister than a simple bureaucratic glitch. This wasn't an error, it was an erasure. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Everything costs more. Housing, healthcare, student loans, just living. You have no idea." "Your father is right, Mark," Sarah conceded, shooting her brother a warning look. She turned back to Arthur. "We do make good money. But things happen, unexpected things. The transmission in my car went last year." Chloe broke her arm. "It's a constant barrage." "The most unexpected thing," Arthur said, his tone shifting from paternal to professorial, "is an expense you haven't planned for. Your mother and I, we lived by a budget. Every single dollar had a job. We didn't have a safety net woven by someone else. We were the safety net. We built it, thread by thread, with every paycheck." He could see them shutting down, the familiar glazed look in their eyes. The lecture was coming. They'd heard it before. But this time, something inside him snapped. The frustration boiled over. It wasn't enough to tell them. He had to show them. An idea, sharp and clear, formed in his mind. A history teacher's ultimate lesson. A living diorama of financial responsibility. "I'm going to prove it to you," he announced. The declaration hung in the air, heavy as the Sunday roast. His children stared at him, bewildered. For 1 month and 30 days, Starting October 1st, I'm going to live on nothing but my Social Security check. That's $1,670. I'll put my pension and my savings away. I won't touch them. I will pay all my bills. The mortgage is paid off, but taxes and insurance, utilities, food, gas, everything from that amount, and I'll show you that it can be done. It's about choices, not about windfalls. Sarah looked horrified. Dad, you don't have to do that. That's insane. It's not a point you need to prove. We believe you. Mark scoffed, a smirk playing on his lips. Seriously, Dad? You think you can live on $1,600 a month in this day and age? Your property taxes alone must be half that. My taxes are paid semi-annually from a dedicated account funded throughout the year, as you'd know if you ever planned ahead, Arthur retorted, his pride stung by his son's dismissive tone. This is about monthly operational expenses. And yes, I believe I can. I believe any prudent person can. It's the lesson you both need to learn, a lesson in distinguishing wants from needs. The challenge was set. It was, in his mind, an act of love. A harsh, pedagogical love, perhaps, but love nonetheless. He would document his spending in his ledger. At the end of the month, he would present them with the evidence, irrefutable proof that the old ways still worked, that financial stability was a fortress built of small, wise choices, not a lottery ticket. On the 1st of October, he began. With a sense of ceremonial purpose, he went to his local bank branch, a solid brick building with reassuringly thick walls. He sat with the young teller and had her transfer the bulk of his checking account balance into a savings account he labeled, "Do Not Touch." He did the same with his pension deposit, which had arrived that morning. All that remained was a small cushion to cover him until the 3rd, when the Social Security deposit was scheduled to arrive. He felt a thrill, the same nervous energy he used to feel on the first day of a new school year, his lesson plans neatly arranged, his chalkboard clean. He was in control. He was teaching. The first 2 days were a symphony of self-denial and smug satisfaction. He canceled his newspaper delivery, telling himself the library was free and a walk there would be good exercise. He declined a coffee invitation from his neighbor Bob, citing a busy schedule. He went through the pantry, taking a meticulous inventory, planning meals that would stretch every last can of beans and bag of rice. He found a half-empty bottle of Eleanor's favorite vinaigrette and felt a pang of sadness, followed by a sense of satisfaction. Nothing wasted, he thought, just as she would have wanted. This wasn't hardship, he told himself. This was strategy. This was discipline in action. He was proving his point, not just to his children, but to the memory of Eleanor, to the very principles that had guided his life. He woke on the morning of October 3rd with a sense of anticipation. It was the day his salary arrived. He made his coffee, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen, sat at the table, and opened his banking app on his tablet, a small concession to modern life he'd allowed himself. He expected to see the familiar pending deposit from the U.S. Who had the power to not just steal his money, but to steal his very financial identity, and why? On the 3rd day of the month, Arthur Pendleton discovered his government had declared him worthless. The Social Security check he was counting on to prove a point to his children, the very foundation of his 30-day experiment in frugality, had simply vanished. Treasury, listed as U.S. TRIAS 310 SOC SEC. The account balance was unchanged. He frowned. Sometimes it didn't post until mid-morning, or even noon. Bureaucracies moved at their own pace. He decided to give it time and went out to rake the leaves, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs. He felt strong, capable, the rhythmic scrape of the rake a comforting sound. He was Arthur Pendleton, a man in charge of his destiny. At noon, he came inside, washed his hands, and checked again. Nothing. A tiny flicker of unease began to dance in his stomach, a cold flutter he hadn't felt in years. He called the bank's automated line, the cheerful, robotic voice grating on his nerves. "There are no recent deposits to this account," it chirped. By 4 o'clock, the unease had blossomed into full-blown anxiety. This had never happened before. In 17 years of retirement, the check had been as reliable as the sunrise. He finally called his bank and navigated the menu to speak to a person, a young woman whose patient tone did little to soothe him. "No, Mr. Pendleton," she said after a long hold filled with tinny pop music. "I'm looking at your account activity now. We have no record of any incoming transfer from the Social Security Administration for you today, or any pending transfers." "That's impossible," Arthur said, his voice tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "It always comes on the 3rd. Always." "I understand your frustration, sir, but there's nothing here. Perhaps you should contact the SSA directly?" His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He thanked the woman and hung up, his hand trembling slightly. There was one more call to make. The big one. He found the number and navigated the labyrinthine phone tree of the Social Security Administration, a disorienting journey of pressing 1 for this and 4 for that. Each minute on hold felt like an hour, the jaunty instrumental music a mocking soundtrack to his rising panic. Finally, after 22 minutes that felt like a lifetime, a weary-sounding voice answered, "Social Security Administration, this is Brenda. How can I help you?" Arthur explained his situation, his carefully constructed sentences starting to fray at the edges. He gave her his name, his date of birth, his Social Security number, the 9 digits that had defined his working life, a number he knew better than his own phone number. There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of furious typing. Arthur held his breath. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the house. "Okay, Mr. Pendleton, I see the issue here," Brenda said, her voice shifting from bored to cautious. "According to our records, your October payment was successfully disbursed." Relief washed over Arthur so intensely it made him dizzy. "Oh, thank God. It must be a bank error then. I'll call them back." Thank you." He was about to hang up, his faith in the system momentarily restored. "No, sir, I don't think so," Brenda said slowly, her words deliberate. "The payment was disbursed. It was just sent to a different account." Arthur gripped the phone tighter, the plastic creaking under the pressure. What do you mean, a different account? I haven't changed my account in 20 years. "Well, sir, our records show a change of direct deposit information was processed for you on September 18th. The payment was routed to a new account at a digital credit union. Looks like it's based in Nevada." The kitchen floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. Nevada? He'd never even been to Nevada. The words tumbled out of his mouth, a confused, desperate torrent. "That's a mistake. I never authorized that. I never requested that. I don't know anyone in Nevada. Someone has made a terrible error." Brenda's sigh was heavy with the weight of 1,000 similar phone calls. It was the sigh of someone delivering bad news for the 8th time that day. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, and her voice was now grave, stripped of all bureaucratic cheer. "According to the information I have, the change was verified using your mother's maiden name and the city you were born in. It wasn't an error. It was a formal request." Arthur sank into a kitchen chair, the phone slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the table. The experiment was over. His lesson in frugality had become a terrifying, real-time education in vulnerability. The money wasn't just late, it was gone, stolen. He sat at his polished oak kitchen table, the morning sun casting a deceptively cheerful pattern across the linoleum floor, and stared at the tablet in his hands. The screen displayed his bank balance, an immutable number that had not changed by the expected 1,670. How do you fight for a lifeline when the system itself has cut the rope? The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the stack of bills neatly organized by due date on the corner of the table. And the person who had stolen it knew the secrets of his past, the names and places that were supposed to be the keys to his identity, sacred and secure. The covenant was broken. The system hadn't just failed him, it had been turned against him by an invisible enemy. The fortress of his well-planned life had been breached, not by a frontal assault, but by a thief who had a key to the gate. The shame he felt was no longer about his children. It was a deeper, more primal shame. The shame of being a victim, of being a fool. For the first 2 days after the call, Arthur did almost nothing. He moved through his house like a sleepwalker, the silence no longer a comforting companion, but an accusing presence. Every object seemed to mock him. The tidy ledger on the kitchen table where he'd planned to document his triumph was a monument to his hubris. The food in the pantry, once a symbol of his preparedness, now represented a dwindling resource, a countdown clock to a future he could no longer control. He'd pick up a can of beans and feel its weight, calculating how many meals it represented. He felt an immense, paralyzing shame. How could he have let this happen? He, Arthur Pendleton, the man who read the fine print, who balanced his checkbook to the penny, who warned his students about the follies of history's unprepared leaders. He had been so focused on teaching his children a lesson about managing a small amount of money that he had failed to protect his entire financial identity. The irony was a bitter acid in his stomach. He'd lock his doors at night, but he'd left the front gate to his entire life wide open. He replayed the conversation with Brenda from the SSA over and over in his mind, her tired voice echoing in the quiet rooms. Nevada, a digital credit union verified with your mother's maiden name. As these weren't the hallmarks of a random hacker in a foreign country. Random hackers were after credit card numbers for a quick score. This felt surgical, personal. It was an attack on his history, on the very roots of his identity. Who knew his mother's maiden name was Kowalski? Who knew he was born in a tiny, forgotten hospital in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a fact he rarely mentioned? The answer was as obvious as it was unbearable. His family. His children. Sarah and Mark. But the thought was so monstrous, so antithetical to everything he believed about the bonds of blood, that his mind recoiled from it as if from a hot stove. He pushed it down, deep into the recesses of his consciousness, and tried to focus on the practical steps. He was a man of action after all. Or he had been. On the third day, which was a Saturday, he forced himself to move. The inertia was a physical force he had to fight against. He gathered the grim trifecta of modern victimhood, a police report number, a fraud alert with the credit bureaus, and a case number from the Social Security Administration's office of the Inspector General. Each call was a fresh humiliation, a new layer of indignity. To the young police officer on the non-emergency line, he was just another case of elder fraud, his story of a lifetime security being violated reduced to a few emotionless lines in a report that he knew would likely go nowhere. He felt like a statistic. To the credit bureau agent, a man who spoke with unnerving speed, he was a Social Security number and a series of security questions, a data point to be flagged. To the SSA investigator, a man with a tired voice in a far-off city, he was one of thousands, a voice in a queue of the dispossessed. "It's a lengthy process, Mr. Pendleton," the investigator had told him, his voice flat and devoid of hope. "We have to trace the funds, work with the other financial institution, conduct an investigation. It could be months before you see any resolution, if at all." If at all, the words echoed in the silent house. Months. He had set aside his pension and savings for 30 days as part of a game. Now, that money was his only reality. He looked at his bank balance online. It was a healthy number, the product of a lifetime of work and prudent investing. But it no longer felt like a safety net. It felt like a shrinking island in a rising sea of uncertainty. How long would it have to last? What if other accounts were compromised? The feeling of security he had cherished his entire adult life, the bedrock on which he'd built everything, had evaporated in less than a week. He knew he had to tell his children. The thought filled him with a dread that was almost physical. How could he explain the magnitude of his failure? It pressed down on his chest, making each breath a conscious effort. This wasn't just about money. It was about a lesson he meant to teach, a final, grand pedagogical exercise for his children, now twisted into a public humiliation before an audience of two. This was the core fear of every man his age realized. To become a ghost in the machine, your existence reduced to a series of errors on a screen, your lifetime of contributions erased by a digital shrug. How could he face them, knowing his grand lesson had imploded so spectacularly, turning him from teacher to cautionary tale? He rehearsed the conversation in his mind, but the words always came out sounding weak, pathetic. He called Sarah first. Her voice was rushed, the familiar sounds of her children clamoring in the background. "Hey, Dad, everything okay? How's the big experiment going? Are you eating something besides oatmeal and righteous indignation yet?" she joked. Arthur's throat closed up. The joke landed like a punch to the gut. "Sarah, there's a problem." He explained it all, the words tumbling out in a rush of technical terms and bureaucratic jargon. Vanished deposit, Nevada Credit Union, identity theft. As he spoke, he felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were describing something that had happened to another person, a character in a history book whose downfall was both tragic and inevitable. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line, so complete he could hear the faint buzz of the connection. Then, "Oh my God, Dad, are you serious? Are you okay? Don't move. I'm coming over. Do you need me to come over now?" Her concern was immediate and genuine, a balm on his wounded pride. All her own financial worries seemed to vanish, replaced by a fierce, protective love. For the first time in days, Arthur felt a flicker of warmth, a pinprick of light in the darkness. "I'm all right," he lied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm handling it." "What did the police say? What's the case number? Did you call the credit bureaus to place a freeze? What can I do to help?" she asked, already shifting into her practical paralegal mode, her mind cataloging action items. "Just be careful," he said, the words catching in his throat. "With your own information." His call with Mark was different. He reached him in the early evening. Mark sounded distracted, the tinny sound of a television, probably a sports game, in the background. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" Again, Arthur recited the grim facts. This time, however, there was no immediate rush of sympathy. There was a pause, a beat too long, a silence that felt calculated. "Wow," Mark said, his voice flat, devoid of surprise. That's crazy. So you're saying someone just, hacked you?" "It seems so," Arthur said, studying the grain of the wooden table, tracing it with his finger. "They knew Mom's maiden name. They knew where I was born." Another pause. Arthur could hear a faint cheer from the television in the background. "Huh. Weird. Well, I guess that experiment is over, huh? Good thing you have that pension. You should probably transfer some of that money back into your checking account. Cover your bills." It was practical advice, but it felt cold, dismissive. There was no, "Are you okay?" No, "What can I do?" No anger on his behalf. Just a quick pivot back to the mechanics of money. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. It was a cold dread seeping into his bones. "Yes," Arthur said slowly. "I suppose I should." "Look, Dad, I gotta run. Got a call coming in. Let me know what happens, okay? That's really rough." And then he was gone, the line clicking dead. Arthur sat in the darkening kitchen, the receiver still pressed to his ear. The disparity in his children's reactions was a chasm. Sarah's immediate, heartfelt empathy versus Mark's detached, almost clinical response. The monstrous thought he had suppressed earlier began to stir again, slithering out from the dark corners of his mind. He tried to crush it, to reason it away. Mark was just practical. He wasn't good with emotions. He was under a lot of stress himself. But the suspicion, once planted, began to grow roots thick and deep. Mark was the one who was desperate for $10,000. Mark was the one who had scoffed at the idea of living on $1,600 a month. Mark, his son, his boy whom he had taught to ride a bike and bait a fishing hook. He felt sick. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neat rows of houses on his quiet street, their windows beginning to glow with warm evening light. Everything looked the same, but everything was different. The world felt menacing now, full of hidden traps and betrayals lurking behind familiar faces. His journey back was no longer just a bureaucratic battle with a faceless system. It was becoming a terrifying investigation into the one place he never thought he'd have to look for an enemy: his own family. The next morning, Sarah came over, a bag of groceries in one arm and a grimly determined look on her face. But the truth, he would soon learn, was far more sinister than a simple bureaucratic glitch. This wasn't an error. It was an erasure. And the terrifying question began to form in the quiet of his kitchen. Who had the power to not just steal his money, but to steal his very financial identity. And why? Arthur Pendleton was a man of routine and principle. "I'm not taking no for an answer," she said, marching past him into the kitchen as if it were a command center. "You're not going through this alone." She was a whirlwind of competent energy. She made coffee, unpacked the food, sensible things like bread, eggs, and soup, and sat him down at the table with a yellow legal pad. "Okay," she said, her tone the one she probably used with difficult clients who couldn't see the way forward. "Let's go over everything, step by step. Every call you made, every person you talked to, every piece of information they gave you." For hours they worked. Sarah's presence was a lifeline in the churning sea of his anxiety. She untangled the bureaucratic knots that had tied him up, writing down contact names, organizing timelines, and helping him draft a formal, notarized letter to the SSA's Inspector General, citing the relevant statutes she'd looked up on her phone. She helped him place a freeze on his credit with all 3 bureaus, a step he hadn't even known was possible. With her there, the overwhelming chaos began to feel manageable, a problem that could be broken down and solved. He saw in his daughter a strength and capability he had often overlooked, clouded by his worry over her finances. He felt a surge of pride that was quickly followed by a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on her perceived weaknesses that he had forgotten to appreciate her profound strengths. While they worked, the topic of Mark hung unspoken in the air, a third person at the table. Finally, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Arthur couldn't hold it in any longer. "Your brother's reaction was different," he said, the words carefully chosen, each one a potential landmine. Sarah stopped writing and looked at her father, her expression softening with a familiar, weary sadness. "Mark's in a tough spot, Dad. He carries it differently. He always has. When he's scared, he gets cold and practical. It's how he copes. He builds walls. Is he scared, or is he just concerned about his investment opportunity?" Arthur asked, the bitterness creeping into his voice, sharp and unwelcome. Sarah sighed, putting her pen down. "That too, probably. He's in over his head. He won't admit it, not to me and certainly not to you, but I know he is. He's been trying to get a loan for that real estate thing and got turned down by 2 banks. His credit is maxed out." Each word was another stone on the growing pile of suspicion in Arthur's gut. Maxed out credit, a desperate need for $10,000, a cold, detached reaction. He looked away from his daughter, unable to let her see the darkness in his eyes. He couldn't voice the accusation. To say it out loud would make it real, a poison that could destroy what was left of their family. He decided to do something he hadn't done in years. After Sarah left, he went up to the attic. The air was still and smelled of cedar and dust. It was a place of memories, of dusty photo albums and Eleanor's preserved wedding dress in a long white box. But he was looking for something else. He found it in a heavy tin trunk labeled Important Papers, old bank statements, tax returns from the 1980s, and a box of his children's childhood memorabilia. In a faded file folder, he found what he was searching for: copies of their old college financial aid applications. And on Mark's application, filled out in his own 19-year-old scrawl, were the answers to every security question imaginable. Mother's maiden name, Kowalski. City of birth, Scranton. First pet's name, Buddy. High school mascot, the Northwood Knights. He had given his son all the keys to the kingdom years ago, filled out the forms with him at this very kitchen table, never imagining they could be used as weapons against him. He sat on the dusty floor of the attic, the flimsy paper in his hand, and felt a cold dread wash over him. It wasn't proof, but it was a map that pointed to a place he did not want to go. His investigation became a quiet, obsessive quest, conducted in the lonely hours after midnight. He started with the Digital Credit Union in Nevada. He found their website easily. It was a slick, modern interface, promising frictionless banking for a new generation. It catered to people who lived their lives online, who valued speed over security. It was Mark's world, not his. For 40 years, he had taught American history to teenagers at Northwood High, instilling in them a respect for the structures and systems upon which their country was built. He believed in cause and effect, in action and consequence, and above all, in the power of a well-laid plan. His life, even in retirement, was a testament to this belief. His lawn was mowed every Thursday, the blade set to precisely 2.5 inches. He knew he couldn't get information from them directly, not without a subpoena. But he studied the site, trying to understand the kind of person who would use it. He then did something that felt like a profound violation of trust, a betrayal in its own right. He started looking into his son's life. Not by asking, but by observing. He knew Mark had a significant social media presence, something he'd always dismissed as narcissistic nonsense. He created a fake profile using a generic name and a stock photo of a sunset and began to scroll through Mark's public posts. It was a portrait of a life he didn't recognize. Photos of expensive dinners with glistening towers of seafood, weekends in Miami with impossibly blue water, close-ups of designer watches on his wrist. The captions were a blizzard of hashtags: entrepreneur, and hustle, and grind, a success mindset. It was a performance of success, but knowing what Sarah had told him, it felt fragile, desperate, like a house of cards in a strong wind. Then he found it. A post from 3 weeks ago dated September 17th. A photo of Mark clinking champagne glasses with a man in a loud shirt Arthur didn't know. The location tag was Las Vegas, Nevada. The caption read, "Closing big deals with my man at Vegas Realty King. Big things coming soon. Nevada." The word flared in his mind like a warning light. It could be a coincidence, a massive, heartbreaking coincidence. But his historian's mind, trained to see patterns and connect disparate events, told him otherwise. The dates lined up too perfectly. The geography was too specific. He needed more. He needed something tangible, something he could hold in his hand. The idea came to him on a Tuesday, the day before trash pickup on Mark's street. The thought of it made him feel like a common criminal, a spy in his own family. It was beneath his dignity. But the need to know, the gnawing suspicion that was eating him alive, was stronger than his pride. That night, after darkness fell, he drove his 10-year-old Buick to the manicured condo complex where Mark lived. He parked down the street, under the shade of a large oak tree, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. He felt foolish, a 70-year-old man in a windbreaker about to go through his son's garbage. He waited until the street was empty, then walked quickly to the curb where the plastic bins sat in a neat row. He opened the lid of Mark's recycling bin. The smell of stale beer and old pizza hit him. It was mostly pizza boxes and empty bottles of imported beer. He dug deeper, his fingers touching the damp cardboard. And then he felt it. A sheaf of papers, folded over, shoved deep inside a pizza box. He pulled it out and, using the dim light of his phone, he unfolded it. It was a loan denial letter from a national bank. The date was from 2 weeks ago. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. Stapled to the back was a printout of a credit report. Mark's credit report. The score was abysmal. And under the section for recent inquiries, there was a list. Car loans, credit cards, and one inquiry from September 18th, the exact day his information had been changed at the SSA. The name of the institution was Silver State Digital Credit Union, Henderson, Nevada. There it was, the smoking gun. The map had led him to this dark and lonely street, to a truth so ugly it stole the air from his lungs. His son. His own son had used his identity, his lifeline, as a tool to try and secure his own financial future. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact, printed in cold, undeniable ink. He drove home in a daze, the denial letter on the passenger seat like a venomous snake. The grief he felt was sharper and more profound than the pain of losing Eleanor. That had been a tragedy of nature, a cruel act of fate. This was a tragedy of choice. A choice made by his son, The person he was supposed to protect, the person who was supposed to care for him in his old age, had instead plundered his life for a chance at a real estate deal. For 2 days, he wrestled with an impossible choice. He sat in his quiet house, the damning letter locked in his desk drawer, and debated 2 paths. What does a father do? Does he call the police and turn in his only son, consigning him to a criminal record and possibly prison? That was justice in the eyes of the law. Or does he confront him, seeking a different kind of justice, a justice that might preserve the faint, flickering hope of a family? That was a father's heart. He chose the latter. He called Mark and asked him to come over for dinner. "Just the 2 of us," he said, his voice a strained, hollow thing he barely recognized as his own. "We need to talk." His bills were paid the day they arrived, logged in a leather-bound ledger with a fountain pen. His pension, a modest but reliable sum from the teachers' union, was supplemented by careful investments made over decades, and, of course, the Social Security check that arrived, without fail, on the 3rd of every month. It was all part of the plan. You work hard, you pay your dues, you contribute to the system, and the system in turn takes care of you. The dinner was a tense, silent affair. Arthur had cooked a simple pasta, a dish Eleanor used to make, but neither of them could eat. The food sat on their plates, growing cold. Mark fidgeted with his silverware, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding his father's steady, sorrowful gaze. He knew. He must have known this was coming. Finally, Arthur pushed his plate away. He stood, walked to the sideboard where he kept his ledger, and reached into the drawer. He pulled out the folded loan denial letter. He placed it on the table between them, directly on the placemat where Mark's dinner should have been. "The recycling bin is for paper and plastic, Mark," Arthur said, his voice quiet, devoid of anger, filled only with a profound, bottomless sorrow. "Not for secrets." Mark looked at the paper, and the color drained from his face. The facade of the successful hustler, the carefully constructed performance of a man on the rise, crumbled in an instant. He was replaced by the terrified look of a little boy caught in a lie. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. A small, choking sound escaped his throat. "Nevada, Mark," Arthur continued, each word a heavy stone. "You went to Vegas to chase some dream, and when that fell through, you decided to use my Social Security to fund it? You used your mother's name. You used the memory of our family to steal from me." Mark finally broke. A sob escaped his lips, a raw, ugly sound that filled the silent kitchen. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I'm so sorry, Dad," he choked out, the words muffled by his palms. I never meant for you to find out. I was going to pay it back, I swear." The deal was real. It was a sure thing. I just needed the capital to get the loan approved. They just wanted to see a certain amount in my account for 30 days. I was going to put the money back before you even got the next check. You never would have known. "You were going to pay it back?" Arthur asked, his voice rising for the first time, a tremor of rage finally breaking through the grief. "You stole my identity. You opened a financial account in my name. You committed a federal crime. This isn't about borrowing a few bucks from my wallet, Mark. You blew a hole in the foundation of my life. For what, a real estate deal? A flashy car? I was drowning, Dad." Mark yelled, his head snapping up, his face slick with tears and shame. "You don't get it. You sit here in your paid-off house with your pension and your savings, and you lecture us about budgets. The world you built doesn't exist anymore. I'm drowning in debt. Every single day is a panic attack about making rent, about the car payment, about just failing. I see you, and I see everything I'm not. I just wanted to be a success. I wanted you to be proud of me." The confession, raw and desperate, hung in the air between them. For the first time, Arthur saw past the betrayal to the deep, festering wound of fear and inadequacy that had driven his son to do something so unthinkable. He saw a man terrified of being a disappointment. And in that moment, Arthur had to face his own role in the tragedy. His lectures, his pride, his ridiculous experiment, It had all been a way of holding his children at arm's length, of judging their struggles instead of trying to understand them. He had offered them principles when what they needed was a partner. He had taught history, but he had failed to see the history being written in his own home. "Proud of you?" Arthur said, his voice cracking, the anger dissolving into a wave of sorrow. "Mark, all I ever wanted was for you to be happy, to be a good man. This is not the act of a good man." Justice, Arthur realized, would not come from a courtroom. It would have to be built painstakingly right here at this kitchen table. The healing began with a demand. Not for retribution, but for restitution. The first step was immediate. Mark had to close the fraudulent account and work with Arthur and the SSA to get the benefits redirected. It would be a humiliating process for him, admitting his crime to faceless bureaucrats. "You will call them tomorrow morning, with me in the room," Arthur said, his voice firm as steel. "You will tell them what you did. Second, the money. Not just the stolen 1,670s, but the entire lifestyle built on debt and delusion. Mark's dream was dead. "You will sell the car," Arthur said. "I don't care what you owe on it. You will get a second job. You will create a detailed budget, and you and I will go over it every single week." It was a covenant, a sacred promise between citizen and state, and he had never, not once, thought to question it. His house, a small but sturdy brick rancher he'd shared with his late wife, Eleanor, for 45 years, was a museum of their shared life. Her gardening tools still hung, cleaned and oiled, on a pegboard in the garage, their wooden handles worn smooth by her touch. "You will pay back every cent you took and every cent you owe to anyone else, and you will get help." "Help?" Mark asked, looking confused, his face still blotchy from crying. "You didn't just make a bad financial choice. This level of desperation, the lies, the high-risk gambles, it's an addiction, Mark. An addiction to the idea of getting rich quick. You will see a therapist, a financial counselor, and you will attend a Gamblers Anonymous meeting, because that's what this was, a gamble with my life. You will do all of it. This is not negotiable." This was the start of the journey back, a path far more arduous than simply reclaiming his money. It was about reclaiming a son. For weeks, the process was a grinding, painful ordeal. The calls to the SSA were humiliating for Mark, as he was forced to confess his fraud again and again to a series of skeptical agents. Arthur sat beside him for every call, a silent, unmovable presence, a witness to his son's penance. It took nearly 2 months of affidavits, identity verifications, and endless hours of hold music before the system was corrected and Arthur's benefits were finally restored. Mark sold his car, taking a significant loss, and bought a used sedan that rattled when it went over 50 miles per hour. He got a weekend job stocking shelves at a grocery store, coming home exhausted and smelling of cardboard and cleaning solution. True to Arthur's word, they met every Sunday afternoon. At first, the budget meetings were tense and awkward, filled with long silences. But slowly, something began to shift. As Mark laid his finances bare, a landscape of crippling debt and poor decisions, Arthur stopped lecturing. He started listening. He heard the genuine fear in his son's voice about student loans, about the predatory interest rates on his credit cards, about the sheer impossibility of saving for a future in a world that felt rigged against him. The numbers on the page told a story not just of irresponsibility, but of a system that was fundamentally different and more unforgiving than the one Arthur had navigated as a young man. He started to share his own stories. Not lectures, but stories. He told Mark about the time he and Eleanor had to live on potatoes and eggs for a month to afford a new furnace for their first tiny house. He told him about his own fears when he was a young father, the sleepless nights worrying about how to provide for his family on a teacher's salary. The wall of pride he had built around himself for decades began to crumble, brick by brick. He was no longer a teacher delivering a lesson. He was a father sharing his humanity. 6 months after that terrible night, a new routine had settled over the Pendleton family. Arthur's Social Security check arrived on the 3rd of every month, a simple fact that now felt like a minor miracle. He had his money back, but he had lost something irreplaceable: his certainty. He no longer saw the world in the black and white of discipline versus irresponsibility. He saw the infinite shades of gray where fear, desperation, and love collided. Mark was still working 2 jobs. He was a regular at his GA meetings. He was slowly, painfully paying down his debts. The flashy clothes were gone, replaced by simpler, more practical attire. He was quieter, more thoughtful. The frantic energy that had once defined him had been replaced by a weary but steady resolve. Their Sunday budget meetings had evolved. They were less about numbers now and more about life. They would talk about Mark's week, about Arthur's garden, about the news. They were rebuilding their relationship on a new foundation, one made not of pride and expectation, but of honesty and shared vulnerability. Arthur's relationship with Sarah had deepened as well. He had helped her with the braces for Liam, not as a handout, but as a partner. He sat with her and helped her create a long-term financial plan, admitting to her his own fears about the rising cost of healthcare and the fragility of his own well-laid plans. He had set out to teach his children a lesson about money and had, in the end, learned a profound one himself. The core lesson wasn't about the virtue of living on $1,670 a month. It was that a life and a family could not be managed like a simple ledger. It was a messy, complicated, and often painful thing, full of unforeseen variables and human frailty. He had learned 3 crucial lessons that he wished he could go back and teach his younger self. First, vigilance is not the same as fear.